Captain Evan Rourke had flown patrol missions for 17 years, long enough to learn that the galaxy didn't surprise you anymore, it repeated itself. Different systems, different names, same outcomes. Ruined colonies. Silent moons. Dead worlds that looked like they were holding their breath long after everyone had stopped breathing. But Gel 9 did not fit any pattern he knew. It appeared first as a dull gray marble on long-range scans, half-shrouded in the residue of an ancient debris field they called the Ash Belt. The belt itself was unnatural, millions of fragmented rocks and vitrified metal drifting in a slow, obedient orbit around the planet like it was still responding to a command that had ended centuries ago. No trade routes passed here. No salvage teams dared linger. Even the most reckless pirate captains gave Gel 9 a wide berth, not because of superstition, but because of reports that never contradicted each other. Nothing survives there long enough to matter. The expedition cruiser Harrow's wake dropped out of slipspace at the edge of the system with a soft, almost reluctant tremor. The ship's hull lights flickered as gravitational harmonics settled into place. On the bridge, the crew instinctively quieted. Even the engines seemed to lower their tone, as if the system itself demanded silence. Visual feed on main display, Ensign Cole reported. The screen flickered once, then stabilized. Gel 9 filled it. At first glance, it looked dead in the most complete sense of the word. Not just lifeless, but erased. The continents were blackened plates of fused stone, fractured by impacts that had once been so intense they had liquefied the crust itself. Entire mountain ranges had been flattened into glassy plains that reflected the dim light of the system's dying star like a broken mirror. The oceans, what little remained of them, were no longer blue or even liquid. They churned in thick, sluggish storms of ash and chemical vapor, rolling endlessly across basins too large to comprehend. And above it all, in orbit so precise it seemed intentional rather than natural, hung the source of the devastation. A warship. Alien. Enormous. Its silhouette was not elegant or brutal or even recognizable in human architectural terms. It was something else entirely, something that had evolved without compromise, without restraint, without any need to consider the comfort of its observers. It did not fire. It did not move. It simply remained. Watching. Lieutenant Harris leaned forward in his console chair, narrowing his eyes at the orbital readouts. That ship has been in the same geostationary position for at least 42 standard years, he said quietly. No drift. No orbital correction burns. Nothing. Rourke studied it in silence. The longer he looked, the more he disliked it, not out of fear, but out of something colder. Recognition without understanding. Any emissions? He asked. Minimal thermal bleed, Harris replied. Power systems are active, but muted. Like it's idling. Or waiting. Waiting for what? Cole asked. No one answered. The question didn't belong to the ship alone. Then the sensors chirped. Soft at first. Easy to ignore. Then again. More urgent. A new signal appeared on the lower deck display. Life. Rourke blinked once. That's impossible. The computer reran the scan. Then again. And again. Each time, the result was the same. A single biological signature had been detected on the surface of Gel 9. Small. Extremely weak. Almost statistically indistinguishable from background noise. But it was moving. Where? Rourke asked, his voice tightening slightly. Harris adjusted the projection. The system zoomed in on a region of the planet that had once been a continent-sized plateau before being shattered into a sea of jagged craters and vitrified canyons. The signal originated there. Inside a crater no larger than a city block. Sir, Cole said slowly, as if speaking too quickly might break the logic of it, that region was classified as total sterilization. Nothing organic above microbial scale should exist within 600 kilometers of that point. Rerun the classification, Rourke ordered. It's correct, Harris said immediately. We've got surface temperature spikes consistent with full atmospheric burning events, radiation saturation off the charts, and trace isotopic signatures from orbital bombardment. It's a graveyard. And yet, Rourke said, watching the faint pulse on the screen, something is alive. The bridge fell into uneasy silence. The signal pulsed again. Fainter this time. Then stronger. It was moving. Not randomly. Not drifting. Climbing. Cole leaned closer to the display, as if proximity might make it make sense. Sir, it's heading upward. Toward what? Harris asked. Rourke already knew the answer before the question finished forming. He turned his gaze back to the orbital warship, still hanging above the planet like a judgment that had never been revoked. And then the surface camera feed finally resolved enough detail to show what was causing the signal. Something small. Charred. Barely recognizable as a living creature anymore. Dragging itself out of the ash like the concept of survival itself had been reduced to instinct and refusal. And it was looking up. Not at the sky. Not at the planet. At the ship in orbit. At them. Rourke felt something cold settle in his chest. Not fear, not yet. Something worse. Recognition of intent without understanding its origin. The hatchling took another step. Then another. And the signal strengthened. It was still alive. And it was coming closer. The bridge of the Harrow's wake had gone unusually still. Not silent, space crews were never truly silent, but still in a way that suggested every sound had been lowered to make room for something else. Something heavier than conversation. Something the mind didn't quite want to name yet. On the main display, the ash-scarred surface of Zone 9 remained fixed in its endless ruin. Cratered plains stretched like broken glass under a dim, distant sun. Lightning crawled across toxic storms in slow, irritated flashes. The planet looked less like a place and more like a memory of violence that refused to fade. And in the center of it all, the signal persisted. Lieutenant Harris adjusted the magnification again. The system responded reluctantly, as if it disliked focusing on what it was seeing. There, Harris said. The image sharpened. At first, it was just movement across ash, an irregular disturbance in the dust storms rolling through the crater basin. Then, gradually, shape emerged. A creature. Small. Wrongly small for anything that had survived what this world had clearly endured. It dragged itself forward using limbs that trembled under their own weight. Its body was scorched in uneven layers, as though it had been exposed to heat so extreme it had boiled survival itself into instinct. Parts of it were missing entirely, scales peeled away, one wing reduced to a skeletal frame of blackened bone and torn membrane. Yet it did not stop. Ensign Cole leaned closer, frowning. That can't be indigenous life. Nothing on the initial bias can match that morphology. It doesn't match anything, Harris replied. Rourke didn't speak immediately. He watched the creature move across the broken terrain with a kind of stubborn rhythm. Not fast. Not graceful. But intentional. Every few meters, it paused. Not to rest. To orient itself. Like it was navigating towards something it already knew. Zoom out, Rourke said. The feed widened. The creature was at the base of a structure, what remained of a planetary relay spire, one of the ancient megastructures used for long-range planetary synchronization before the bombardment reduced the world to ash. The spire was broken in half, leaning like a dead finger pointing nowhere. Its internal latticework had melted and refrozen into jagged ribs of metallic glass. The wind passing through it produced a faint, hollow resonance that sounded almost like distant static. And the creature was climbing it. Harris blinked. It's scaling the structure. Cole shook his head. That's kilometers tall. There's no traction. No grip points. It should fall immediately. It should be dead already, Harris added. But it wasn't falling. The hatchling, because now, in some reluctant corner of perception, that was what it had become, hooked what remained of its limbs into fractured seams of metal and stone. It pulled itself upward in short, violent bursts. Every movement looked like it cost more than it should have been able to afford. Rourke watched in silence. The alien warship above the planet shifted slightly. It was subtle, barely detectable in orbital drift sensors, but unmistakable in intent. A correction. A recalibration of attention. It had noticed. What are its weapons status? Rourke asked. Harris checked quickly. All systems still active. Energy reservoirs at low idle. No firing sequence initiated. Yet, Cole muttered. The hatchling reached a broken segment of the spire where the structure narrowed into a spine of exposed alloy. It paused there, swaying slightly. The wind pushed against it hard enough to tear away more fragments of burned tissue. For a moment, it looked like it might finally collapse. Then it screamed. It was not a sound that translated cleanly through senses. It wasn't structured like language or even animal distress. It was raw pressure, a vibration that seemed to scrape against the edges of perception itself. Every crew member on the bridge felt it in their teeth. Cole flinched. What the hell was that? Rourke didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the screen. Because the alien warship had responded. A faint glow bloomed along its underside. Not a full weapon discharge. A warning. Energy spike detected, Harris said quickly. Ship is charging a directed pulse, low yield but precision grade. Target? Rourke asked. Harris hesitated. Then, surface origin of biological signature. The hatchling. Cole looked up sharply. It's going to fire on it? Not it, Harris corrected quietly. They've identified it as a threat. Rourke's jaw tightened slightly. Based on what? Harris hesitated again. Based on persistence. That didn't make sense at first. Then it did, in the wrong way. The hatchling was still climbing. Still alive. Still refusing to stop. The alien ship fired. A pulse of concentrated energy struck the surface below the spire. It wasn't an explosion in the traditional sense, it was more like reality briefly forgetting how matter was supposed to behave. The ground vanished. A circular section of terrain simply ceased to exist, replaced by a glowing scar that hissed as atmospheric pressure tried and failed to fill the void. The shockwave rippled outward, flattening debris and vaporizing anything that remained structurally intact nearby. The base of the spire shuddered violently. Then cracked. Then began to fall. Cole swore under his breath. Nothing should have survived that. Harris zoomed in again instinctively. The hatchling had fallen. Half buried in collapsing debris, motionless for a fraction of a second too long to be comfortable. Then its wing twitched. And it moved. Slowly. Painfully. It pushed itself free from the wreckage as the structure around it disintegrated. Rourke leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing. It's still alive, Cole whispered. Not in disbelief anymore. In something closer to disbelief's exhausted cousin, acceptance that reality was no longer following familiar rules. The alien warship adjusted its position again. This time, there was no ambiguity. It was preparing something larger. The silence after the first strike didn't last long. It never did in space. On the bridge of the Harrow's wake, systems kept reporting data, officers kept breathing, the ship kept existing. But everything felt slightly detached from reality, as if the universe had just demonstrated it could be rewritten without warning. Lieutenant Harris stared at the tactical feed. That was a warning shot, he said quietly. Cole turned sharply. A warning shot that deletes half a kilometer of terrain. Harris didn't answer immediately. The sensor replay looped the moment again and again. Orbital energy discharge, atmospheric distortion, surface annihilation. A clean absence where land used to exist. No, Harris said finally. Not a warning. A correction. Captain Rourke didn't take his eyes off the surface feed. Correction of what? Harris hesitated. Of persistence. That word again. Persistence. The hatchling was still on the screen. Barely. A broken shape amid collapsing stone and scorched dust, half buried in the aftermath of a strike that should have erased anything biological down to molecular residue. The surrounding crater glowed faintly with residual ionotation, like the ground itself was still trying to decide whether it had been allowed to exist. The creature twitched. Once. Then again. Cole swallowed. It's not possible. Then stop expecting possibility to apply, Harris muttered. The hatchling dragged itself forward. No longer climbing. No longer running. Just moving. One limb. Then another. Then nothing for a moment that stretched too long to be comfortable. Then movement again. Slow. Unsteady. But deliberate. Rourke felt something tighten in his chest. Not sympathy, this wasn't something simple enough for that. It was recognition of a pattern that didn't belong in any database he had ever seen. It wasn't surviving because it was strong. It was surviving because it had not yet decided it was allowed to stop. Report on alien vessel, Rourke said. Harris checked the feed. Energy systems spiking again. This time, higher output. Cole looked up sharply. They're escalating. Confirmed, Harris said. The warship above Zone 9 had shifted position again. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, it adjusted its orbital vector. It was no longer simply hovering. It was focusing. Like an eye narrowing. The underside of the alien structure began to glow in layered bands of blue-white light. Not a single beam weapon, not a conventional charge sequence, but something more complex, multinode energy convergence, distributed across multiple sections of the hull. A system designed for certainty. Rourke had seen weapons like that before. They weren't built to miss. They're going for surface annihilation, Harris said. Not localized. Planetary segment saturation. Cole went pale. That would sterilize the entire hemisphere. Harris nodded once. Yes. The hatchling lifted its head. It was still on the surface. Still alive. Barely. But it was looking upward again. Always upward. as if the sky itself had become the only target it recognized. The relay spire behind it collapsed completely, its remaining structure giving up under gravity and damage stress. It fell in slow motion, scattering debris across the crater basin like broken bones. Dust rose in thick, choking clouds. The hatchling stood in the center of it. And screamed again. This time, it was louder. Not physically louder, sensors didn't register increased amplitude, but denser. More focused. As if whatever was producing it had stopped filtering pain through any biological limit and started directing it instead. Cole flinched. Why is it doing that? Rourke didn't answer immediately. Because he wasn't sure the question was correct. The alien warship responded instantly. The charging sequence accelerated. Impact window closing, Harris said quickly. We're looking at full surface level strike in under 20 seconds. Cole looked up. It's going to die. Harris didn't correct him this time. The hatchling moved. It dragged itself out of the crater's center. Each motion slower than the last. Its remaining wings scraped uselessly against the ground. One of its limbs failed entirely mid-step, collapsing beneath its weight. Still it moved. 10 seconds. The warship's energy systems reached critical threshold. 9. Atmospheric distortion began forming above the target zone, thin at first, like heat haze, then rapidly intensifying into visible warping of light itself. 8. Rourke's hand tightened on the edge of the console. Can we intercept? Harris shook his head immediately. Not at this range. Not even close. 7. The hatchling reached the edge of the crater. It stopped. For the first time since the scan began, it wasn't moving. 6. Cole whispered, it's done. 5. Rourke didn't look away from the screen. 4. The creature lifted its head. Not toward the ground. Toward the sky. 3. The alien ship's underside flared brighter. 2. Energy convergence reached full lock. 1. The hatchling spread what remained of its wings. And screamed directly into orbit. The strike fired. The surface of Zone 9 vanished in a column of light so intense the sensors briefly lost calibration. The atmosphere ignited in cascading layers, turning sky into a blooming fracture of incandescent destruction. For a moment, there was only white. Then static. Then silence. On the bridge, every display flickered. Cole exhaled shakily. It's gone. Harris didn't respond immediately. Because something was wrong. The life signature hadn't disappeared. It had, fragmented. Still present. Still moving. Not in one location anymore. In several. Rourke narrowed his eyes. Report. Harris stared at the readout. That's not possible, he said slowly. What is it? Rourke asked. Harris swallowed. It didn't die. A pause. Then, quieter. It split the signal. And far above the burning planet, the alien warship shifted again, just slightly. But this time, it wasn't correcting aim. It was bracing. The bridge of the Harrow's wake had settled into a tense quiet that felt less like calm and more like waiting for a verdict. Every console was still active. Every system still reporting. But the crew had stopped reacting like they trusted what the instruments were telling them. Lieutenant Harris kept the surface feed locked on Zone 9, cycling between sensor modes as if one of them might eventually disagree with the others. They didn't. Thermal scans showed heat scars where nothing should still be warm. Gravimetric data showed shifting mass patterns in zones that had been vaporized minutes ago. And biological tracking, what little remained of it, refused to collapse into a single point. Instead, it persisted in fragments. Ensign Cole stared at the display. That strike should have erased it. There's nothing left to track. Harris didn't look up. There is. Cole frowned. Fragments aren't a life form. Rourke spoke quietly from the center of the bridge. Not traditionally. On the screen, the crater basin of Zone 9 looked like a scar that had been burned into the planet itself. Glass terrain stretched outward in jagged rings. Atmospheric distortion still shimmered faintly above impact zones, where energy had torn through layers of ground and sky alike. Even the weather had stopped behaving like weather, storms folding inward, collapsing into unstable spirals. And in the middle of it all, something was still moving. Harris zoomed in. The hatchling was no longer in one place. Cole leaned closer. What am I looking at? Harris adjusted the overlay. Multiple concurrent signatures. That was the problem. There wasn't one signal anymore. There were several. Flickering at different points across the blast zone, near collapsed terrain, along fractured ridges, within the skeletal remains of the relay spire's base. Each one was weaker than the last. Individually. But together, they formed something that refused to disappear. Cole's voice tightened. That sensor error. Aftershock ghosting. Harris shook his head. It's cross-verified. Rourke stepped forward slightly. Meaning? Harris hesitated. Then said it plainly. Meaning it didn't stay in one body. Silence followed. Because that statement shouldn't have made sense. On the surface, Zone 9 was no longer a place so much as a collapsed equation. The atmosphere had been stripped and rewritten in patches. Ion storms rolled through thinning air like broken circuitry. The ground was a mixture of vitrified stone and shattered alloy, still glowing in places where heat had not fully dissipated. Nothing should have survived there. Nothing should have been able to move. But movement continued anyway. A fragment of the hatchling dragged itself across a fractured beam of metal, then vanished into dust. Another flickered into existence higher along the slope of the ruined spire. A third appeared briefly near the crater's outer edge before disappearing again into shifting debris. Each fragment behaved as if it still belonged to something larger than itself. As if distance was irrelevant. As if damage had not ended anything. Cole swallowed. It's not moving like an organism anymore. Harris nodded. Correct. It's moving like intent, Cole said quietly. Rourke didn't take his eyes off the screen. It's climbing. Harris zoomed out again. The fragments were converging upward. Not randomly. Not chaotically. Purposefully. Toward the remains of the relay spire, still jutting into the sky like a broken spine pointing at orbit. Cole whispered, why would it go up? It can't reach. He stopped himself. Because everyone already knew. It didn't matter whether it could reach. It was still trying. Above the planet, the alien warship adjusted its position again. Subtle. Precise. Like a lens tightening focus. Harris noticed immediately. Energy buildup increasing. Rourke glanced at him. Weapons? Full convergence sequence, Harris said. Multiple emitters. This is beyond warning protocols. Cole's face went pale. Then what is it? Harris looked at the readings for a long moment. Then answered. Finalization. The word felt wrong in the room. Too clean. Too absolute. On the surface, the fragments of the hatchling reached the base of the broken spire. And began to ascend. There was no single coordinated movement visible to senses. No unified body. No obvious structure holding them together. And yet they climbed as one system. One direction. One refusal. One decision that did not change regardless of what was removed from it. Cole's voice was barely audible. It keeps going up. Harris nodded once. Yes. Rourke's eyes narrowed slightly. It's not escaping. A pause. It's approaching. No one corrected him. Because there was only one thing above them worth approaching. The alien warship fired again. A controlled sweep of energy carved across the surface, erasing unstable terrain and collapsing remaining structures into molten silence. The strike was precise, measured to remove persistence, not react to it. One fragment vanished. Then another. For a brief moment, it seemed like the process was working. Cole exhaled. Finally. But Harris was already shaking his head. Because the signal had not ended. It had shifted upward. Higher. Closer to orbit. Rourke watched the screen for a long moment. Then said quietly. It's still climbing. And far above the shattered planet, the alien warship kept charging. The bridge lights of the Harrow's wake dimmed slightly as the ship compensated for the gravitational disturbance building over Zone 9. No one ordered it. No one needed to. Everyone could feel it. Lieutenant Harris stared at the orbital readouts, his fingers hovering over controls that suddenly felt irrelevant. They are fully charged, he said quietly. Captain Rourke didn't look away from the main display. Yield? Harris swallowed once. Sufficient to sterilize the entire planetary surface and disrupt low-orbit infrastructure in a sustained burn cycle. Cole let out a slow breath. That's not containment. That's erasure. Harris didn't disagree. Above the planet, the alien warship no longer looked like it was waiting. It looked like it had decided. The underside of the vessel was alive with layered energy structures, geometric lattices of light folding into one another, each one feeding into a central convergence point. The glow was no longer localized. It spilled outward along the hull like veins igniting in sequence. The system was preparing something final. Something absolute. Rourke's voice was low. Surface status. Harris checked. The crater basin of Gel 9 was barely recognizable now. Entire regions had been flattened into fused glass. Atmospheric pressure was collapsing unevenly, creating slow-motion storms that dragged debris across the surface like exhausted ghosts. And yet, the signal was still there. Cole leaned in. It's still moving? Harris nodded once. Yes. Cole's voice tightened. Where? Harris zoomed in. For a moment, there was nothing but interference, static from overlapping energy fields and residual ionization. Then the system corrected itself. And revealed it. The hatchling was no longer scattered across the surface. It had converged. Not rebuilt in any conventional sense. Not healed. Not restored. Concentrated. A single coherent presence made from fragments that should not have remained coordinated after total annihilation. It stood, barely standing, at the shattered remains of the relay spire, now reduced to a jagged vertical spine pointing directly into orbit. Its body was broken beyond recognition. One wing was gone entirely. The other hung in torn fragments that caught the wind like useless fabric. Large portions of its form were missing, replaced by scorched voids and exposed structure. But it was still oriented upward. Always upward. Cole whispered, "It survived that." Harris didn't answer immediately. Because survival was no longer the correct framework. "It's not surviving," Harris said finally. "It's continuing." Rourke's eyes narrowed slightly. "And where is it continuing to?" Harris didn't need to zoom further. Everyone already knew. Orbit. The warship. On the surface, the hatchling moved. Not quickly. Not gracefully. But decisively. It dragged itself along the broken spine of the spire, using whatever remained of its limbs to pull itself higher. Each movement left fragments behind, but the system did not degrade, it simply redistributed. Where one part failed, another compensated. Where one fragment vanished, another asserted presence higher up. Cole stepped back slightly. "That's not biology." Harris nodded. "No. That's persistence architecture," Rourke said quietly. No one responded to that either. Because it sounded too close to intention. The alien warship reacted. Not with hesitation. With acceleration. The energy lattice beneath its hull tightened, compressing into a single focused point of convergence. Atmospheric distortion above Gel 9 intensified, forming a visible column of warped light connecting orbit to surface. Cole's voice cracked slightly. "They're going to fire." Harris nodded. Final discharge sequence initiated. Rourke remained still. "Target." Harris hesitated. Then answered. "The source of persistence." On the surface, the hatchling reached the highest remaining point of the relay spire. There was nothing above it now except open sky. And the warship. For the first time, it stopped moving. Not because it had run out of energy. But because it had arrived. It lifted its head. And screamed. Not down. Not across. Up. Directly into orbit. The alien warship fired. The strike was not a beam. Not a pulse. Not a wave. It was a collapse of directed reality, an engineered failure of matter coherence along a precise vector. The surface of Gel 9 disappeared beneath a pillar of light so intense the sensors aboard the Harrow's wake overloaded for a fraction of a second. The atmosphere ignited in layered sheets of distortion, peeling away from the planet in glowing fragments. Ground structures dissolved into atomic mist before they could register as destroyed. The relay spire ceased to exist. The hatchling's signal vanished. Cole exhaled sharply. "It's done." Harris didn't respond immediately. Because the system hadn't confirmed termination. Instead, something unexpected appeared. A new signal. Weak. High above the surface. Cole frowned. "That's not possible." Harris zoomed in. And froze. Because something was rising. Not from the surface. From the trajectory of the strike itself. A distortion in the aftermath plume. A coherent structure forming inside the collapsing energy column. Fragments. Reassembling upward. Cole took a step back. No, that's not." Rourke raised a hand slightly, silencing him. The signal climbed. Through atmosphere. Through ionized collapse. Through the fading remnants of the warship's strike path. Not escaping it. Using it. The alien vessel shifted for the first time in a way that looked almost uncertain. Its weapon systems did not recharge immediately. They hesitated. For the first time since arrival. Cole whispered, "Why isn't it firing again?" Harris stared at the readout. Then said, very quietly, "Because it's no longer sure where to aim." The hatchling rose. Not whole. Not stable. But undeniable. A flicker of coordinated existence ascending through the last scar of destruction, moving along the only remaining pathway that connected planet to orbit. Toward the warship. Toward the thing that had tried to erase it. On the bridge, Rourke finally spoke. Status of alien vessel. Harris checked. Then paused. Bracing. Cole blinked. Bracing for what? Rourke watched the screen. As the hatchling's fragmented signal reached the edge of atmosphere. And continued upward. And said. Impact.